This is actually written as really early in the process. In fact, I think on your handout it's written as the second step of the process before strengths. And that's because of the value that I initially described about doing safety planning right from the beginning. There are always safety issues involved when you're doing family work, and you're constantly assessing that, and you're asking the group to do that as a whole. Whoops, this thing goes fast. Okay. So let's talk about just a quick definition of what a crisis is. A crisis is usually a turning point. It's a serious point where things can either get a lot better or they can get a lot worse. So if you think about it in terms of, say, for example, a medical crisis, that's usually some kind of turning point in the person's health care. And the same is true when you're talking about emotional crises and situational crises that families face. And so in the wraparound process, you do a separate crisis prevention plan. Similarly, for those of you in community mental health, you do that for people who are in sort of higher intensity programs because you're anticipating that crises are going to occur. And what you're trying to do is to come up with a quick reference point that the family can use and that you can use and the supports can use so that you've got something to look at and know what to do should something occur. The other reason that it's important to do crisis prevention planning is you're saying to folks that crises are going to occur. And a lot of times people feel like if a crisis occurs, it means I really blew it and I haven't made any progress whatsoever. Particularly, I find that with people who experience depression. You know, so when you're really, really depressed, you know how you look at the other guy and you think like, man, they've got it made. Nothing ever goes wrong for those folks. And we all know that that's not really true. So sometimes if you tell people that crises are normal for families and they're normal for individuals, everybody, you can normalize that process, and doing that in and of itself makes it a lesser big deal. It's also important to do crisis planning at the beginning or at a time when things are going well versus when you're right in the middle of a crisis. We all know the difference in doing this. It's better to do those things when you're calm versus when things are really in an uproar. So, same as the rest of the wraparound process, the more informal supports you can have involved and the more professional supports you can have involved, the better, and more reliance on informal support so that when the professionals pull out, the crisis plan is still there. So we're going to talk about two different kinds of crisis planning processes. One is to create a proactive plan, and one is to create a reactive plan. And basically what that means is proactive means you're going to try and avoid the crisis by following certain steps, and reactive is it happened and what should we do now? So to get started, you describe to the family that throughout this process, issues are going to come up, crises are going to occur, and you do sort of that normalizing process. Life is a series of ups and downs. This is one of the downs, and we want to look at it and just sort of get it right out there on the table. So together as a group, you're going to define some areas that are difficult and come up with some strategies to face them. So you ask people what they're most concerned about in terms of safety. Sometimes the concerns are obvious because of formal systems involvement. So protective services is involved because there was a safety issue. Or you're being monitored by protective services. So somebody's checking out what's going on in the home because there have been some issues. Or the child has had a history of explosive behaviors. So sometimes there are formally identified safety concerns, and sometimes they're really not identified at all. The one that keeps coming into my head is a family that I worked with who had multiple stresses, like everything you can possibly think of. But one of the biggest stresses for the kids is that the mother had a chronic health problem and was frequently hospitalized, a respiratory kind of thing. But every time she was hospitalized, you would think it was like the first time that it ever happened. They had nothing in place to prepare for this hospitalization that occurred on a regular basis and actually was happening more frequently. So the kids, particularly, were in a constant state of panic, waiting for the mom to go down and wondering who was going to take care of them. And they all acted it out in different and not healthy ways. That's because there was this hidden kind of thing. So giving people a chance to describe what they think might go wrong and what might be a crisis, and not just the parent. Everybody in the group has to do that. Kids have all kinds of fears, and a lot of them are real legitimate. So really listening to what people say. And similarly to what Heather describes, if you've got your easel, you can write it up there. If you got a piece of paper, write it down there. But make sure everybody's concerns get heard. The other thing that you do is then you ask them to rate whether or not these issues are mild, moderate, or severe. So you do kind of a triaging process, basically. And this is a good intervention because sometimes you'll see people who everything is a crisis, from the serious stuff to, I broke my nail. And everything goes into like total disarray anytime any of those things happen. Or you'll work with some families where nothing is a crisis. And you're sitting there getting really nervous while you're seeing certain things go on that you feel like might be unsafe, but everybody's thinking everything's just okay. So if you do this triaging process, you're teaching the family and the team a tool to learn what they need to respond to and at what intensity level. So you don't want a crisis plan on everything. You want the crisis plan on one or two issues that you think are the top sort of concerns and safety issues. And then, is it okay to erase now?
Oh, yeah.
Then what I do is a little bit of teaching. I tell people that crises generally have a beginning, a middle, and an end. And for most of us, if you think about crises that you've gone through, they tend to follow the same pattern over and over again because as people, we're not that prone to change. So something usually happens a few times before we go like, gee, I better do something different. Sometimes it happens all the time and we never do anything different. So I use kind of like a little bell curve sort of thing and say, usually something starts to happen, something's going wrong. And there's a certain buildup where your feelings are getting churned up. Maybe there's a series of events. So in the situation that I just described, the mom hasn't been feeling well for a few days. The kids are starting to feel nervous. One of the kids starts acting out in an angry way. And you can pretty much predict this thing is going to happen the same way every time. The mom says, don't worry, I'm fine. And the kids are getting more and more anxious. And then it peaks. She gets sick. They have to call an ambulance. The church comes in and helps them. Everybody helps take care of them. And then things start to resolve and the mom comes back out of the hospital. And then you repeat it over and over and over again. So you ask the family to describe how this crisis has occurred in the past, and you sort of map it out for them in a visual way. And by doing visuals, right away you're giving them an intervention tool. There's something really powerful about seeing things played out that gives people a good understanding, especially younger kids. They connect to this pretty quickly. And if they have difficulty describing, how, some people say like, I don't know, he just blows up. Nothing happened beforehand, You can use sort of like who, what, where, why questions to tease out the story a little bit and, really analyze it. And for people who are in frequent crisis who don't have a lot of insight into how these things occur, sometimes these questions can work. Then you ask other people in the group, this is where it's great to have a good team, to provide their perspective. If the mom says, but I was feeling fine, and then the aunt says, no, you weren't. I saw you the day before, and we talked about it. Same thing that Heather was describing, where when you've got other people involved, you get the details. So you ask them for their perspective. And this is kind of a cognitive behavioral tool that you can use, is you can ask people at each point along this continuum of the crisis, what were they thinking, what were they feeling, and what did they do? So you're trying to provide some differentiation between what were thoughts, what were feelings, and what were actions. And that's a complicated thing to do, especially when people are under stress. That just, goes by the wayside. You said, he just exploded is what comes into your head. But no, he was thinking, I think something's wrong with Mom. He was feeling fearful. He acted by trying to distract and, create attention to himself. So helping clients I learned when I was doing substance abuse treatment. They used to call it like TFAs, thoughts, feelings, and actions. And you don't do it in a real complicated clinical way, but start to ask those questions. What were you thinking here? What were you feeling, and what did you do? Will help people so that when a crisis does occur, when they're under stress, they won't feel like they just have to act the same way that they've always acted. So for example, for this kid, one of the changes that you might want to make is this kid needs permission to say, I'm afraid. And that might be the intervention that prevents the, part of the crisis. You also want to ask the group, and this is strength-based, tell me about a time that you managed this crisis really well. What did you do? And get their strategies, because what you might find is there were certain people involved that we hadn't thought about involving. There were certain things that people did. Maybe the communication was more open, etc. So ask about strategies that they've used in the past that have worked. And then you want to develop your plan. So now you've got a lot of information. You know how this thing occurred. You know where people were along the way in the process and what's worked well in the past, and you can set up a proactive plan. And a proactive plan doesn't mean it's never going to happen, but it might reduce the intensity of what goes on. It might reduce how frequently it happens, or if there's a crisis, it might reduce the duration of how long the crisis goes on. So you're trying to kind of cut things off at the pass. And these are the passes that you have the opportunity to cut them off at. So I just described. So looking back at this cycle, where could we have done something different? And whenever possible, be behaviorally specific, because you're going to be writing this into a plan. Well, gosh, back here, I guess I could have called the aunt, thinking I'm not feeling well, and I might need to have you on call in case I'm not feeling better later. Or this might be a point where I check in with the kids and see how everybody's doing, or something. But you look through those steps that led up to here and figure out what you could do differently, and that's basically your plan. And then you want to ask people to commit to doing things differently. So if you come up with a list of steps that they're going to do, then you want to have them say, all right, Heather is going to call so-and-so, at this point. And a good thing to do if you've got kind of a fun family, or even a not-so-fun family, is have them practice it. Role plays are really good. Sometimes they're inappropriate. Like if feelings are just too high, this can bomb on you. It seems like silly to them when they're just too emotionally, churned up. But doing a role play is really good, because one of the things that you find is the potential missing links in the plan. Like, okay, Heather's going to call me, but whoops, she doesn't have my number and she doesn't have a phone. A lot of times you get to like the real concrete things that will make the plan bust when you really want to use it. And the second type of plan that you can set up is called a reactive plan. So that's if the crisis occurs, what are you going to do? And similarly, you have to think of specific behavioral steps that people are going to follow, ask them to commit to those steps, and if they're willing to do them, you can do the role-playing kind of thing. But reactive plans are really focused on practical details. So for example, if a kid gets kicked out of school, what's everybody going to do? who's going to contact the such and such worker? What's another school that we can consider for them? What are we really going to do? Who needs to be involved? And the same kind of thing, real focus on practical behavioral things. A lot of times for people who've gone through crises, thinking about this in terms of psychiatric crises because I've had more experience with it, it's like the post-hospitalization that's the most traumatic for people. Nobody, who's going to take care of my cat? Etc. Who paid the rent? Those kinds of things. So when they're out of home things, this is what this reminds me of. You also want to ask if there's anybody that should not be involved in the plan. The people involved really want to have control over their plan, and sometimes there are family members and other people that just aren't real helpful in a crisis. And sometimes they don't want everybody to be notified about what's going on, so ask them who they don't want to have involved. One thing that's really important is when a crisis happens, you have to follow the plan. And what has a tendency to happen to us as professionals in that situation is the crisis occurs and we go into crisis. You get the call and you're like, oh my God, what am I going to do? It's just a natural reaction that your anxiety level's going to go up. You got to pull out your plan so that you can guide the family through their plan. Because there's just a real strong tendency to get kind of swept up in whatever's going on and trash the plan and not do it. And then, of course, the whole thing's been a complete waste of time. So after you've had a chance to use the crisis plan for some reason, you want to do something to evaluate whether or not it was effective. A lot of times what you'll find is you guys missed a big piece and you didn't know it until the crisis happened and you tried the plan and it didn't work. So, it's kind of a trial and error sort of thing. But you want to do an evaluation process. So what worked, what was ineffective, what needs to be tweaked. And I think one of the really important pieces is, in this process, what did you learn about yourselves? Again, sometimes people tend to see things as all or nothing. So something goes wrong and they feel like they're the worst parent on the planet. And the kid feels like a loser and everything went wrong. But in fact, what did you just learn about yourself, when there were difficulties? And that's how people really grow. And you've got to do some kind of reassurance about this as being a learning process versus, that you were a failure of some kind. So whenever possible, don't change the priorities of the crisis plan in the middle of the crisis. Sometimes you have to. Again, you kind of want to balance being structured and being flexible, but whenever possible, stick to the plan. And also, you want to be cautious about not reinforcing crises. All of us in the room, I'm sure, have done a lot of crisis work. And sometimes it can make us feel really good about ourselves to step in and do our thing, and everybody loves you, and, or you make yourself overly available and they're not reliant enough on other people to help them in the crisis, and lo and behold, you're not going to be there forever. So you don't want to reinforce the crisis by keeping things in a constant state of crisis intervention. Yeah.
Some crises last several days.
Mm-hmm.
And they have somebody that would sit and go through the crisis with the family.
In the mobile crisis team, no, we didn't use that approach. Actually, we didn't. We considered it quite a bit, having a mobile crisis team, but no.
We have used, though, a lot of respite, because a lot of times, somebody mentioned that initially when we talked about how to handle things, sometimes just a break in the action or a little extra support for the parent or for the kid really can do it. Sometimes that's all we really, really need.
And next week, or the next training, we're going to have one of the staff from Detroit Wayne County talk about respite and how to access it so that we're all aware. Because we very much want that as part of the array of services that can be purchased by the wraparound. And it is a, what's called in the Medicaid manual, a B3 service. And the Michigan Department of Community Health does encourage us to use those kinds of services. And you're right, it gives the family a break. And the kid a break.
Is each one of
Go ahead.
I was just going to ask are you talking about using in-home respite or on-home respite?
Either.
Either one?
Part of what we did is one of the things that's nice about wraparound, it really encourages you to be creative and innovative and really, really think outside the box. I'm sorry. So we have mentors. We had worked closely with the Association for Children's Mental Health with family advocates and just building resources that will provide respite. The reality is the kids that we serve in these types of projects are really difficult kids, and they're multi-stress families, and crisis will happen. And, you know, crisis happen in our lives, so why wouldn't we expect the same to happen in their lives? Oftentimes when it does happen, we get all worked up because they're having another crisis. Well, we just had one yesterday, so what's the big deal? That's just how life works. So what becomes important is to plan for it and to have the resources available. So we had in-home respite, like a child giver that will come into a family home so a mom could leave, you know, for a while. You know, we use mentors that take the child away from the home for the mom or the dad to get a break. We use respite. Still to this day, we use FEI, Family Empowerment Institute. They have respite where you can place a child in a home. They have home providers that will provide respite so we can get things together and regroup in the process. And respite is really important because the reason I took the mic was to say this. Your team should not be making any drastic decisions in the midst of a crisis. Your team should not be making any drastic decisions right after crisis has ended. You need to reconvene after all emotions are kind of back at level and then make a decision. Part of the thing that we, especially having had the fortune to work in juvenile justice, we're really focused on community safety. And sometimes when something happens that our kids do in juvenile justice, we're like, okay, we got to remove them from the community. When it's not necessarily in their best interest. It may be easier to address the crisis, you know, but there may be other options available, which is why something like respite is so important. It can allow us an opportunity to remove a child from a situation so we can figure out, okay, what can we do next? So I encourage you, when you do have a crisis, not to go making some drastic decisions about placing the kid in a higher security level, removing the child from the community. That may be the outcome of what you guys, when you guys do come together and assess how the crisis went, that may be your best option. It may be. But what I'm suggesting is that that's not a decision you make in the midst of the crisis or when all the emotions are really high.
The other thing that's really important about respite, to return to that, is we don't allow ourselves respite in the, you know, just the way that, you know, values are. I should be able to handle it is a really strong societal value and a really strong parental kind of value. And to let people know that it's okay to take a break and that in fact it's healthy to take a break is something that's really important to convey to families, because I just think that's a very hard thing to let go of, that moral. And to let other people come in and help you and give you the rest that you need to keep going, because you need to emphasize with families that they're in this for the long haul, and that in fact the respite is going to help them be in it for the long haul.
Which is also a reason to consider building respite into your treatment plan. So that, because these are kids oftentimes who became involved in community mental health at 5. So their mental health disorder is not going away. You know, they have ADD and they will be ADD. They will have this disorder for the rest of their lives, so they need to learn how to manage it. And so families need to learn how to manage it. So how do you give respite to a family that has a child with a severe emotional disturbance? How do you do that?
And I think also that's why you build in those natural supports, because we're not always be there to offer the formal respite. And there's a lot of ways to get respite, and that's why you want, the church down the street that has a hour basketball or whatever that can get the kid there, or you want, the aunt or the play aunt down the street or across town to be available. So I think that's why it's so important to always push first for the natural supports, and that the formal respite is down the line, or if there's nothing out there at all, but to force the formal, the natural supports first.
Exactly. That's a really good point. When I mentioned building in a plan, that's exactly what I meant. I meant even, really building in a plan, like as an action step for a child to get involved in PAL. Those of you who have kids, I don't have kids, but I can imagine it can be tiring sometimes. So when, as summer's coming up and I see my friends who have children starting to worry, because it's like the kids are going to be out of school. What am I going to do? Because school is respite. So those are really the kind, it's not just,
Friend is supposed to step up and say, I'll take it.
oh, I got to go work. I'm busy. You were going to say?
Well, in talking about the informal supports. In talking about the informal supports, and you're talking about, the hour of basketball, one of the challenges in working with families in general is that's considered a reward, and perhaps reframing that as a respite and not doing it because in the long run that's going to have negative effect. You're right. You're not on record for that one. Okay.
Yeah, the reframing of things becomes important because as the wraparound facilitator, those of you who will be facilitating, you'll have to educate a lot of your colleagues in other systems about the value of some of those things. You'll have to help them see that, yeah, basketball may be seen as a reward, but it's also a good way to build social skills. And we've used basketball as an action step for a number of different reasons. Beyond respite, we have building social skills. It's about, for those kids that are really isolated, making friends, actually growing their social network. Those will be important things. And you'll often be kind of fighting the battle of helping other professionals see the value in these things.
Yeah.
Multiple high-risk crisis factors. Should you do a separate plan for those so that it's not confusing to have it all lumped into to one?
Say that again.
If you have multiple high-risk factors for different crises, should you do a separate plan for each of those so that it's not kind of confusing or confounded?
Like 10 crisis plans. I mean, some of it might differ from your plan. Sometimes, how, I think this is true a lot of times at the beginning in working with a family, there's a lot of stuff to clear out. I mean, a lot. And your first year might be clearing out. And so, what you label as a crisis and what you label as part of the plan, you don't want the person to feel really bad, like I've got 10 potential crises at any time. So if everything sort of looks like that, that might be your wraparound plan.
Yeah, and you really want, I was just looking at the form you guys created, you really want it to be useful. I know you're creating a form that will work for juvenile justice and community mental health, but you also want to create a form that works for children and families. Like, literally, like those of you who have all that stuff on your refrigerator that came home from the school, literally you want that plan to be on the refrigerator so when it jumps off, they can go to the refrigerator and say, okay, we're supposed to call Heather. Let's call her. You know, it's supposed to be a reference tool. So make sure when you look at your form that it's useful for families, not just useful for the systems. That's really important.
Yeah, that's great, because one of the things we're trying to push is that the families, the youth in the family has as much information on themselves as we have on themselves. So everything is transparent. So there's nothing hidden about what we are working with them on, so that if they don't have a refrigerator, maybe we buy them a corkboard or whatever. But all the documents that we have about them that they need should also be in their house.
Well, that's
And
great.
in the kids' room if they wanted, whatever.
That's great. That goes to the value of persistence and the whole nothing about me without me.
Exactly.
And you may end up, no matter what form you create that will work, you may have to come up with one that's completely separate for the family. But in looking at your form, I mean, it's nicely done. With safety plans or with any plan, you know, if you're going to share it, it has to be something that, you know, they can read, you know, that's written in their language. Crisis plans may be on the refrigerator. They might be a laminated card for someone's wallet. It might be pictures instead of words for a 5-year-old. But if you're going to go through all the work to do it, make it useful for everyone, because everyone's going to need to have that when a crisis happens. Any last questions on crisis and safety planning? Yeah.
Is each wraparound facilitator available to the family 24 hours a day, weekends, or how do you handle that?
With us, we have a on-call pager, so families have access to someone, and we rotated it with our team.
And they always know.
Families
Like, if
always
you're gonna be
immediately.
away- if you're going to be away for a vacation.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah, stuff like that.
Mhm.
But if on the weekend, I mean, if you're not on call that weekend, Carrie Patterson is on call. So when you call that number this weekend, you'll get Carrie Patterson because I'm off.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest with you, I haven't done that on every occasion with every family. Families know immediately that they have access to a 24-hour pager. I'm not going to tell you that they get a schedule, you know, because let's be honest, sometimes if they really like you, they're going to wait till you have the pager to call you. So, or not call you, right. But if I had a family that I was working with who, you know, I could tell, you know, there was a potential, I would let them know, like, look, I don't have the pager this weekend, Lisa does. But I know what's going on, and I'll tell Lisa if something happens and you call them, have her, you know, it'll be okay for Lisa to call me, and I'll let her know that. Yeah.
Well, and the other thing, because we're working on an on-call system, and the point is
Everybody
that,
might not know what that is, what you're working on.
well, just, you know, rotating the pager.
No. Why you're saying this, that you're,
Because I'm working with, you're talking about,
We're working with the Department of Human Services for wraparound services. I'm from the Guidance Center. And one of the things in talking with my staff is it's not that they get a hold of us for everything. It's that we want to move upstream and make sure that they create a support system that they get a hold of. And we need to be part of that if it reaches a certain level, so that it's not creating that dependency, it's creating the process of planning. And so that's really what we're trying to get at, as opposed to everybody's got our number and can call us 24/7. You know, and it reframes it with everyone.
yeah, it reframes, and also I think it's part of the discussion of the whole process that, and always, if it's strength-based, it's also an empowerment model for the family, so they don't
Absolutely.
always think, I got to call the professional, or I got to call my wraparound
Right.
facilitator.
'Cause that's
so I
not what
think
you
that's
do.
always part of the conversation, and the strength-based approach and the empowered model, that you're always saying, Aunt Janie is really, in the past, Aunt Janie's been really helpful when
Mm-hmm.
this has come up, rather than calling me.
And whether it's your crisis plan or your treatment plan, plan of care, family plan, whatever you're choosing to call it, from the beginning with your child and family team, you are planning for the end or the transition or when you and all your formal support people are not going to be around. That is so important throughout, because with what we found, learn as we go. We came in and we were offering a lot, to a community in a neighborhood that was resourceless, and through not, we just created some dependency issues because we wanted to help, and we had this great philosophy we were using, and we forgot to plan for the end at the beginning. So when we talk about a behavioral aid or a respite worker, initially we even brought a group in that was going to, we were going to contract with and train with and have that. And I guess it was fortunate that that didn't work out so much, because we had to come up with our own system, and we used family and neighbors and friends. And at one point, we had a couple families who had a behavioral aide with the kid in school who could just check in, who wasn't, they didn't have the degree or the special training, but they knew the kid and they could keep the kid in check a couple hours so that kid could stay in school. And that person was around after the plan ended. So whenever possible, you want to get those informal supports in place. Sometimes you just can't, but,
Typically, I think what happens is that at the beginning, there's more full support involvement. I mean, you're talking about people who might, some families have resources, other families really don't have that many resources. So a lot of times, initially, you are providing things on a more formal basis. But again, keeping in mind that immediately you're trying to find folks to replace you. So that if you're seeing, call Carlin as the heading for the intervention on every wraparound step and the crisis plan, there's a problem with the way that you did the process. But in the beginning, you'll see more of it. But hopefully over time, as you continue with these folks, you'll see it less and less. You also have to do some educating with people about the crisis on-call pager. I mean, just to get back to, I used to have a friend who would answer the phone. This is so-and-so. This is the crisis pager. What is your emergency? It wasn't like, hi, can I help you? It was like, this better be good. And even though that sounded harsh, it really did kind of make you have to have something important to say. And so you want to think about how to describe that
Yep.
service to the families you work with.